great part of mathematical activity today is organizing. We like to offer the results of our mathematical activity in a well organized from where no traces betray the activity by which they were created. This objectivation is a habit of mathematicians from the oldest times. It is a good habit and it is a bad one. We freeze up the result of our activity into a rigid system because this objective, because it is rational, and because it is beautiful. And this we teach. Few people know that mathematics is an activity. Little children are taught mathematics as an activity, but as they mature into rational beings, we are prone to teach them a well organized, prefabricated deductive system of mathematics because rational beings may be supposed to understand deductive systems. You know that it does not work very well. So, obviously, Stuart, that was Hans Freudenthal, 1971, and this is my best impression of Tom Holland on The Rest is History. Of course, listeners, you're actually listening to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, but because I've listened to so many episodes of The Rest is History on the way to Ireland and back, and I know, Stuart, you're a big fan of the podcast as well, I couldn't help but choose that passage from the paper we're going to explore today. And I could even feel my intonation feeling like Tom Holland a little bit.
It was truly wonderful, Kieran. What a Tom Hall. I thought I was on The Rest is History there with the man himself. Slightly disappointed you didn't choose to do it in the style of maybe Winston Churchill or one of the other greats, but
I
maybe next time.
did consider whether I was going to put on Freudenthal's accent or not. I thought, no, there's only so far people can suspend disbelief. Yeah, so this is Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, podcast for time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. We're going to explore curriculum and mathematical coherence, exploring the tensions in teaching and learning number, which is a research paper, I think published in 2025, if the date I have is correct. And it focuses on some of the tensions that we might see in the classroom, but certainly what they see is, when people are authoring curricula or designing national curricula, they see. And I think that has big implications for us. I mean, shall we start with a general summary of the sort of the mood of the paper, what they hope to achieve, what they think they can rationally argue? What's your impression, Stuart, of the paper? Because it's not necessarily the easiest to engage with. I didn't find anyway.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that, Kieran. But I think for me anyway, the main argument here seemed to be that the authors had been looking at some sort of modern primary mathematics curricula. I think in particular they looked at curricula from Australia and Mexico, and really trying to look at it through the lens of how is number being developed, this idea of number being developed. And their main sort of feedback here seems to be that it's often just exclusively looked at through counting, basically just sort of discrete, counting discrete items. And they're suggesting here that this brings a sort of incoherence because number is also continuous. And then as we get further through the curriculum, we see ideas like measurement becoming difficult to understand or less easy for students to relate that to the work they've already done in number. So I think that the authors here are sort of arguing that there's a case to be made for reevaluating how we introduce number, and particularly maybe paying less weight onto just discrete counting and looking more at maybe measurement and seeing number as a continuous quantity.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent précis of the study. I think some of the weaknesses that are worth keeping in mind, like as you say, Australia and Mexico were the only, poor victims of their analysis, and they got it with both barrels. They also focused on the enacted curriculum, so it's almost one step removed from actually. It's more about teaching than it is about learning, and I think there's something to be said about the methodological analysis in terms of, I think the coding seemed pretty rigorous, in terms of they were able to code the number of times, and they contend that that's counting comes up much more than in a solitary way than it does in some of the ways that it might do. And so, the reason I brought it up for this week is because I think it raises some interesting points, even if it doesn't manage to satisfy some of the arguments. That's suppose, up to the reader to decide. But we're going to focus on our big takeaways and the conversation or slash discussion that arises, particularly around curriculum coherence, because I know that's really, really important in schools. And so the first thing you alluded to there, Stuart, is the idea that counting isn't the whole story and that curriculum coherence starts at the foundations. And I thought the paper suggested that many primary curricula frame number almost entirely in terms of counting discrete objects, like you said, with little emphasis on other interpretations of number. And they suggest that this one sided approach can hinder pupils' later understanding. For instance, fractions seeming like a brand new idea rather than a natural extension. As a secondary teacher, their suggestion that measurement and continuous quantity should feature much earlier. What's your gut reaction to that? Because that was almost like the big takeaway for them. I felt was that counting isn't the whole story, and that we need to think about the foundations initially. What do you think?
So my gut reaction there is that I'm interested in that idea. I think that idea carries weight, no sort of pun intended here, because measurement is something that occurs around us. I think we often say, students need to sort of get real world context. So we kind of teach them mathematics and then we stick it into context, almost as if the context comes later. But actually, mathematics is all around us in context. So if we can use sort of tangible ideas like length and mass early on with students and help them get an understanding of number as being not just discrete in the sense of the counting, then I think we've got a really good way of building that deep kind of conceptual understanding that we're aiming for. You talk about coherence. I think that's so important. And again, you talked about the enacted curriculum there, because what we write on paper in our curriculum is not necessarily what the teachers, are working on with the students, and it's not necessarily what's received or retained by the students at the end of the day. And we talk about coherence, and I think the point I want to make about coherence is that as educators, we might look at a curriculum and think, wow, look at that great logical sequence. That looks fantastic. But we must view the coherence through the eyes of the student instead. It's got to make sense for them. And so I think that this idea of, re-evaluating our approach to number by bringing in some more tangible sort of scenarios, length and mass in particular are good ones for me, is going to help lay the foundations for what, as a secondary teacher, it feels to me students often see as completely disconnected ideas like fractions, decimals. They don't appreciate that these are just quantities again on the number line. And I think if we can start to build that foundation early on, then we will see some benefits and reduce some of the kind of misconceptions and confusion that occurs later on in the curriculum.
Because they frame it in this way that it's the national curriculum of a country and it doesn't provide X, Y, and Z. But I don't think there are many curricula out there that actually try to do that. Like if you look at the English national curriculum, the whole way through primary and secondary, it's just a list. There's obviously the non-statutory guidance, but it's a list of statements, and I think, I always talk about how 80% of our work as teachers is the thinking we do. That's where the thinking deeply comes from. I think we should be freed up to spend our time thinking about things that are really important. And I think that coherence, in as much as, like we always say, we're trying to tell a story and we need to know where those connections are and where the examples of number feature without having the label of number. In the same way as, last week you were doing that fractions with Cuisinart session with year 3/year 4 teachers. And they realized that algebra wasn't something that you taught at the end of year 6. It was this sort of way of generalizing patterns that they see and or even just describing the patterns that they see. And I think there's a lot to that as well. Because like if we think about almost like the conservation number, composition number, and sort of number sense in general, magnitude's normally the one in conversation that gets missed out. And for me, it's very much a case of like when pupils are exploring spaces, that's still a precursor to their understanding of number because the space that they can manipulate, both mentally and physically, then allows them the space to manipulate numbers in that same way. You get the studies where you're talking about the relative distance between numbers and how that impacts on sort of their spatial reason, that kind of thing, because those numbers aren't technically spaced out. So, from that angle, I think, yeah, it's looking as teachers, it's looking at the decisions that we can make, but our leaders need to give us the space to think about those things. And if we've got the sort of the right information and the right support, then I think we have the opportunity to make sure we get as many of those connections in as possible. Because I don't think there's a national curriculum that has been designed in such a way, and I don't think there ever will be, because it's just a list of here's the mathematics in a rough sequence, but not necessarily a connected or interconnected sequence. I don't know. Am I being unfair on national curricula?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you are. I think that there has been a sort of move to reduce mathematics curricula to some sort of ordered list. Like I said earlier on, they feel like they make sense to the educator, but are we really thinking about the development of these ideas throughout the whole curriculum? We spend a lot of time talking with primary colleagues and secondary colleagues, and I think you and I both agree that those labels are not helpful because we are all teachers of mathematics. It's one sort of through journey, and quite often secondary teachers actually are working with students who are needing the sort of support that expert primary teachers can give due to the gaps in the knowledge that they have. So I think that not only have curricula been kind of reduced to almost like a list, I think a lot of teachers, unfortunately, through the pressure they feel to cover the content, see it as a checklist just to be sort of ticked off and covered. And what we're not really looking back here is the student experience and the interrelation between some of the topics. There are curricula who will do a block of number and then a block of algebra and then a block of whatever, and not take those opportunities to show that algebra is actually the generalization of number and that we can do these two things hand in hand. So going back to what you said about the school I was in last week, working with those year 3 students, they were truly wonderful because they hadn't really had much experience with Cuisenaire rods, but yet so quickly were they able to show me halves and quarters, thirds and fifths, and talk about the relative sizes of between the two. We got to the point where we were actually comparing 5 thirds with I don't know, 3 sevenths, and looking at which was greater. And there's no formal counting in there. It's all about the relationships. And I think those are the things that, if, as you say, teachers maybe had a bit more time and a bit more opportunity to access really good sort of training on these things, then they would be able to weave a lot more of that into their teaching, and that would then see us, moving away from this idea of the curriculum as a sort of a list of discrete items to be covered. Unfortunately, I think the students see it as that as well. And you and I have talked before about this idea of kind of golden threads. We've heard a few of our friends talking about the golden threads that are woven through the maths curriculum. And actually, I've sometimes talked about these golden superhighways, these ideas that if you can wrap your head around the concept, suddenly it unlocks a huge amount of mathematics. And one of those things is unitizing, because I was talking to a group of teachers recently. When we count like ones. So 1 is 1, and 2 is 2 of these one things, or of these unit things. But then, of course, when we move to fractions and we say, well, what is 2 sevenths plus 3 sevenths, and the students always tell us that it's 5 14ths, because they're not unitizing the seventh in that case. And it's further up the curriculum when you get to algebra, 3x plus 2x. A lot of students will still think that would be 5x squared, or they would do something with the x's rather than realizing that the counting unit is the x. And so it keeps going because you get to surds, irrational numbers, root 2 plus 3 root 2. is for Route 2. But again, students' minds are blown. But that golden thread or golden superhighway starts right down in the very, very youngest years. And that if teachers are able to see that trajectory and connect it up, then I can see doors opening for students that are currently locked effectively.
Yeah, I mean, that superhighways thing. Yeah, because those kids are such a big advantage. They've got unfettered access to the rest of mathematics, whereas everyone else is sort of piled up on the old freeway. I don't know if you've ever been up the M6. You've got the toll road. What's it called? It's called the Midlands Freeway. Oh, I can't remember what. It's got a pretty reasonably cool name. Yeah, but yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, because these guys, they're sort of real against this thing called the new math. Um, but as far as I can tell, it's from the mid 20th century, so it's not very new. But that's when they seem to suggest that this reform made maths into this structured, abstract system. And I suppose as teachers, the thing is, how prevalent were national curricula then? When did the national curriculum come in England? I don't think it was 1950, so um, it's interesting. That's one of the it's almost like they're reeling against these guys. But with most things, there's a halfway house, I think, because I do agree that the learner's perspective is really, really important because ultimately it's the learner who has to make sense of this. We as teachers typically will have made sense of maths and will have made meaning ourselves, and we want them to be able to make this meaning too. And it's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be very much that coherence is complemented by your pedagogical approach, so to speak. So we've almost got two takeaways there. Counting isn't the whole story, and coherence was lost, needs finding, perhaps. But that's I think it's still interesting to think about that because we as teachers and as subject leaders, we can think about the opportunities we're providing. Because whatever curriculum you've got is going to be the skeleton, and then you're going to put the meat on the bones. If I can keep my metaphors singular and unmixed. I think related to that, the next big thing that sort of stood out to me was the curriculum versus classroom and almost framing it as bridging the great divide, whether that may be the tension between the official curriculum and the teaching or the learning that we know that benefits learners. And I think this sort of said that when you dictate the content and the pacing in particular, you know, you're doing your pupils a disservice when really you should be focusing on things like problem solving, reasoning, and connecting ideas. Now, this resonates from the conversations I have with teachers a lot, the conversations I have with maths leads a lot, that those are the elements that are missing from classrooms quite often. For instance, in England, the appendix was this de facto, here are the acceptable methods you must teach. And so people only taught those methods. And so what we're doing is when we're when we're chasing the curriculum, we are focusing solely on the superficial. We are, like you say, racing through content, trying to get as much done as possible, but at the expense of reasoning, problem solving, and connecting those ideas. So, for instance, we don't feel we've got time to let all pupils do a low threshold, high ceiling problem. I mean, what's your take on that? Because, like I say, it resonates with conversations I'm having. It's the kind of thing that I advocate we try not to do. So, like in my schools, reasoning, fluency, problem solving, they're all the heart of the approach. So it's not optional. It's not the bright kids in inverted commas get to it. It's this is how we teach maths here. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It's a race to nowhere. It's funny because as you talk about conversations with teachers, I have conversations with teachers, and almost all of them say they feel pressure to move on. Always feeling under pressure to move on, and at times they admit that they are not confident that the students are actually ready to be moving on. And so this is, for some reason, we've created this system where we feel that we're racing towards some end goal. And for some students who are sort of quick to grasp the new maths, that system's not so bad. Especially if to keep going at that pace, we are sacrificing those deeper, enriching experiences that you just described there. So to keep going at that pace, we basically demonstrate methods, they practice methods, they memorize methods, we move on to the next method. And as I say, for some students, that's okay because the memory's great and they're able to sort of see some of those connections. But for so many students, that high tempo, demonstrate a technique, practice, hopefully remember, move on, it falls apart because they then end up into secondary school and they spend 3 or 4 years just doing the same maths over and over and over again because they didn't have that chance to build the conceptual understanding. So, as I say, it's a race to nowhere. And what I think is important is that teachers, particularly maths leads, heads of maths, and school leaders, have the confidence and have the courage to actually say, just look at what's happening. It is not working for the majority of students. Never mind those who are completely lost and left behind, which is leaving school, unable to sort of function in terms of numeracy in society. So have the courage to say, let's take a step back and have a bit of a rethink about what we're doing, particularly earlier on in the curriculum where we don't have quite the same, high stakes exam pressures as perhaps secondary school brings, and say to teachers, we can help you create this mathematics sort of environment in your classroom, which is underpinned by conceptual understanding and concrete and pictorial representations that show the connections across those golden threads that we talked about. And so I think that it's time for a fresh look, and that there is sort of material there that will support teachers. There are teachers who teach in this way regardless of the list that they've been presented with, and those teachers have success. And I think it's a case of highlighting that good practice, finding those good materials, and helping teachers and schools make that transition from the current sort of race to the bottom, race to nowhere, to something much more rounded and something that's going to really benefit all the students in their maths journey.
I think you may get a bit of flack for saying a comment about high stakes, but I know what you mean because it's high stakes for the pupils at GCSE because it's their lives, but it's high stakes for the school and the school's leaders at primary when you've got those key stage end of key stage two examinations. Yeah, so if anyone is offended, let us know in the comments because that'll bump up this with the various algorithms. Don't email me because I'll just ignore it because I know exactly what Stuart's getting at. But yeah, no, I think yeah, it's really interesting because the more we sort of explore this, I mean, as if it wasn't already apparent, the amount of thought that needs to go into the provision of a really high quality mathematics experience for pupils. I mean, it's a lot, and especially in primary when you've got say roughly 13 subjects, depending on where you are, to think about. But I do think it's worth doing because once you've thought through it once, then you're just supplementing that thought process the next time. Like the first, I was exploring the addition of three add-ins at like this training I was being trained, and I remember the first time I had to teach that and really spending time thinking about the use of color, which manipulatives I wanted to use, what representations, when was I going to bridge across 10. And now I can just, it's almost as if that's already there. So if someone says, right, you're teaching the addition of three add-ins, then off you go. I could do it instantly, and all of that thinking would still be there. It's almost like it's not a residue. It's strong. It's stronger than that. It's like a part of me. I don't really know how to articulate that. So I think even though it does, there's a lot of thinking to do. I think the first time you do it, it's difficult, it's time consuming, but every other time after that is, I think it definitely gets better. Or certainly there's it's less time intensive.
I think that's lovely the way you phrased that there. Just whatever sort of knowledge you've managed to sort of internalize through putting the time in there, describing it as just part of you. And I think that is probably a really good description for a lot of learning in different senses. If you invest time really thinking hard about some task or whichever element of maths you're maybe going to be teaching, then you've created something in yourself in the way that you approach that. And so it is part of you. But what's so nice, and I think you kind of said it already anyway, was that not only does teaching that particular bit of maths come maybe more easily to you next time it comes around, but it's transferable too. So the time and effort that you put into planning, lessons on, various different topics, what you gain from that experience makes it easier to plan lessons on other topics further down the line. And in that way, we're continuing to develop and improve as teachers. And surely the consequence of that is that the outcomes for our students continue to grow with us. If we get better, they get better. And if we don't, if the opposite of that is a kind of stagnation. And there's a risk that whatever profession you're in, whatever sector you work in, you reach a kind of comfortable level where you don't really push yourself on any further because it's good enough. But I think what we know is that with what feels to me and what I'm hearing from other teachers, increasingly more challenges being faced by students for various reasons. I think it's even more important that teachers are thinking really deeply about the way that they're planning and the way that they're developing ideas and the way that the ideas in the curriculum connect up to one another.
Yeah, it reminds me of something we definitely covered in one of our early webinars, and maybe people who've listened to the podcast for a long time would be familiar with me saying this thing, but it's if you're a math subject leader, knowing the journey intimately allows you then to support your teachers in getting into that point. Because if you know why the decisions have been made and the way they've been made, the pedagogic model, what's good, and even just with the sequencing and the connections and the structure, as a subject leader, if you are fully aware of that, and it won't happen overnight, it may be, what are we in? It's June now. You sit down and you spend time thinking about those, particularly those tricky bits, the bits that teachers talk about, as the pupils always struggle here. And if you know why those decisions have been made, then you know whether or not they're necessary or whether the struggle is unproductive and stuff. And just as you're speaking, that's why I thought, okay, so there's a lot for teachers, but actually subject leaders as well can almost lighten that load. And so yeah, so that it's almost as if this paper hasn't necessarily given me anything to take away, but it's definitely good food for thought. So while I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it, I think thinking about the points raised as a subject leader, as a school leader, as a teacher, always really, really important, because if the coherence doesn't exist in your whatever you're using, then I think it falls to you as a collective to ensure that every child who goes through your school has the opportunity to access that high quality journey through mathematics. Because then by the time they get to you guys in secondary and it's time for their high stakes tests, then they are able to confidently manipulate things like surds or quadratic equations, because I've seen adults shudder at the word surd before, maybe they had a bad experience in school. But yeah, I think that's where I've landed on this.
I would agree. I think that the paper itself is a good source to spark the conversation, and then just to encourage teachers, subject leaders, that almost regardless of your curriculum, you can start thinking about how can I broaden this understanding of number, and rather than just being focusing on counting. So just thinking about questions like quantity and asking students about how much, how far, how heavy, things like that, just to get us sort of sense of measure and mass. I talked about earlier, length, time as well, are kind of things in the real world that students can relate to. And then obviously, we want to. You talked about coherence, but bringing that connection into the via a number line, more than likely bringing that connection into negative numbers, but also decimals and fractions, which is huge. I mean, try sticking a surd on a number line. That's good fun, given that it's got a never-ending number of decimal places. So wherever you place it, you're not quite right. And that blows my mind. So thinking about opportunities to make those connections more sort of clearer for the students to see for themselves. So the paper itself, interesting enough, I suppose, maybe narrow in some senses, but I think it has tapped on, an issue that is worth a bit of thought and could have some positive, implications for students who are maybe not seeing those connections across the whole kind of story of maths.
What a great cliffhanger to end the episode on. Stuart's going to try and place a surd on a number line in the next episode. If you can't wait, you can always join the Rest is History Club. No, don't. Because you won't get this episode. You'll probably get one about Hannibal early if you do join up. So we're enjoying that series. But if people are thinking about changing their curriculum, are thinking about what the future of mathematics looks like in their school, then do get in touch with me and Stuart, because we've been thinking really, really deeply about our curriculum that we've developed, the story of mathematics, which runs from birth to the end of primary. So for nursery, reception, and then all the primary sort of classes. If now is the time for a change, and obviously if you've spent time thinking about a change and you've just never anything, then this is not for you. But if now is the time, then do get in touch, because what we try to do is take the evidence base on terms of how we learn, how pupils learn, pedagogical approaches, the knowledge, different types of knowledge that teachers need, and trying to put them somewhere that can make the enacted curriculum and the lived curriculum really, really powerful in the way that the authors of this paper perhaps hope. And if we go back to Freudenthal at the start of the episode, where maths is an activity, a sense-making activity, then it might be for you. But like I say, if you've just installed something, now is not the time to change it.
The only thing I might add is that what we're trying to do with the story of maths curriculum is provide a resource that will help teachers become better rather than stagnate. So there's opportunities in there with the subject knowledge and the pedagogical approaches and the models and representations for teachers to just think again, perhaps about how they would traditionally teach an idea, and then see if they can add something to that. Plus, there's tools on the story of maths to help teachers be much more sort of responsive and adaptive to the needs of their student, because I feel quite strongly that a one-size-fits-all curriculum is not really the answer, given that schools and classrooms all over the world contain students with very different backgrounds and prior experiences and prior knowledge. And so a curriculum that allows teachers to be adaptive is a really powerful thing, and that's what we have with the story of maths.
Yeah, and because the Tadape community is global, I think probably got listeners in all of the UN recognized countries and beyond, and so we've intentionally made the story of maths national curriculum agnostic, and so it's what do we think the story of maths is, and that becomes quite apparent. So on that bombshell, looking forward to the next episode. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Absolute pleasure, Kieran. Thanks for having me on.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.